Hello, everyone. Thank you for braving the storm to be here with us tonight. We made you earn your wine a little bit. And welcome to those on this live stream, wherever you are in the world. This marks the 14th year of Climate Week, with events unfolding in the city and around the world. People everywhere are coming together for the sobering task of figuring out how to build a more just and sustainable world. And if we want that new world, we need new stories. And we're hoping to convince you tonight that the field of journalism can do better. I can't think of anyone more qualified to start this discussion than Farah Warner. Farah is the climate director of the Solutions Journalism Network. I had the good fortune to meet her a few years ago during Climate Week, and since then have seen her fierce dedication to this field, and it is my pleasure to introduce her. Please welcome Farah Warner.
Thank you, Katie. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate all of you who have braved this storm. It is my deep pleasure to be here, particularly with three amazing journalists who are going to reflect on and give you insight into the work that they've done and how we can really think about, as the title of this presentation says, how do we move from apocalyptic to accountable in our reporting on the changing climate and the climate crisis. So I want to first sort of ground you in what we mean by solutions journalism. So there can be a lot of discussion and a lot of questioning about what do we mean by solutions journalism. This is not happy news. This is not pretty news. This is not good news about something. This is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to huge social problems. And the climate crisis is the one thing that sort of binds all of us together in this room and is binding all of us together in this city this week. And so I want to take you a little bit deeper into what we mean by solutions journalism and how we practice it. So it will help you sort of set things up as we go forward in these talks. So solutions journalism has a framework. We call it the 4 pillars framework. We're interested in what is the response to the problem. So we need to know that there is a problem, and then we are going to reflect on what the responses are and what the solutions are. If a problem isn't well known, we will still want to cover that problem. We never say that we shouldn't be covering the issues and the problems that confront our society. We absolutely must, and we will continue to do that, but we need to report the whole story. Too often what has happened in journalism is our theory of change is that if we just shine a spotlight on something, somebody will go and do something about it. And oftentimes people do, but we never cover that. We just hop from one story to another story to another story. And that is particularly true in the covering of the climate crisis. I want to take us a little bit deeper. So it obviously is about covering a response to a problem and how it happened. It's really important as we think through solutions journalism is that we're focused on the how of it. It's not the who. We're not into hero worship. And that's definitively what we don't practice in solutions journalism. Hero worship is for other things and other places. There are people doing amazing things in climate right now, but we say they are actors in the solution, and what is most important is defining and reporting on the solution itself. So it becomes the key character. It must provide evidence of impact. If you can't show me that the response that you are reporting on has actually been effective, and particularly effective for organizations and communities that are most affected by climate change, then it's not solutions journalism. This is one of the most important parts of solutions journalism, is making sure that you can clearly define the evidence of impact. Because too often, evidence of impact isn't there, and evidence of effectiveness isn't there. And so what we're looking for is qualitative and quantitative evidence to show that. And I know that the panelists who will come after me have done a great job of doing this. We also want to look at how do we produce insights, notably, again, for the communities most affected by climate change. So we're really focused on how do we help others respond. One of our sort of greatest theories of change is to say we're moving from being the watchdog to the service dog. I happen to love dogs, and I saw a dog wandering around today, and so I'm very happy to say I completely own this idea of being the service dog. We are here to be in service to our communities, and too often in journalism, we are completely disconnected from our communities. We're far more interested in the flashy story, the clicks, the impressions, the page views, which do absolutely nothing to help communities mitigate, adapt, and be resilient to the climate crisis. And finally, what is really important is you always need to point out the limitations. There are no silver bullets to this crisis. There's absolutely no silver bullet to the climate crisis that we are living through at this present time. Whether it is the people who are in Puerto Rico right now without power, affected by this, by those people in Pakistan, 33 million people displaced by floods. This is a crisis that affects all of us around the world. So we need to make sure that when we are doing solutions journalism, that we absolutely are critical of the solutions and we look at the limitations, because this effectively helps us guard against greenwashing. Failure is also okay. We have a lot of solutions journalism, which we call instructive failures. Sometimes things don't work out the way you think they are going to work out. Sometimes a solution is proposed and it feels great and it's working really well, and then something happens. Things change. But you can always learn from failure. And pilots are also good. In some cases right now with climate, we are in the testing phase, and that's great. But if you're covering this as a journalist or reading this as a news consumer, be aware that sometimes those pilots are going to need to take time and years potentially before they'll ever prove out that they are effective. I wanted to focus on why this is important to the climate crisis right now. Too often, and particularly in this country, we have highly politicized climate. You're either for it or you're against it. And we know that the research shows that that's absolutely not true. Yes, there are people who are deniers. Those are not the people that we are necessarily going to talk to. But 90% of the people in this country think about climate and spend time engaged in climate. Some of them are actively engaged. Some of them are wondering what to do. Some of them are doubters. But we focus too much on the deniers and not enough on the rest of the people who are really, really worried and concerned about what is happening to our climate. And so Pew Research has shown that in 72% of people in 17 countries are somewhat or very concerned about climate change, and that will affect them personally at some point in the future. I would say that they're not worried about whether it will affect them in the future. I would say that particularly this year and last year, they're worried about how it is affecting them right now. The weather that we're having in New York right now is unseasonable. You could say it's unseasonable, but the weather patterns are changing. And we know this, we can feel it. This is not September weather. It's really not September weather. But what we find is that the news and the way it covers climate is deactivating. We cover it through a doom and gloom apocalyptic approach that really turns people off. And what ends up happening is people aren't even paying attention. It's not even that they're not paying attention. They're just not even engaging or being involved in any coverage around climate. This is deeply difficult for journalists and others like those who present reports like the IPCC report. And this is from 2021. is when an organization called ACOS, which is a research organization, looked at the headlines. 79% of the headlines on the 25 most linked to news sites evoked fear, hopelessness, and or a feeling of being overwhelmed. If you're faced with that every single day, do you really think you're going to get up and take action? And that is not, and this is what we effectively are trying to sort of lean into and push against in solutions journalism. We want to move from problem-focused journalism to response-focused journalism, from inequitable coverage to equity-forward and community-centered coverage. This is absolutely critical in the coverage of climate. Environmental racism is a thing, and it is happening around the world. And if we do not think of ourselves in journalism as being equity-forward and moving from inequitable coverage to equitable coverage, then we haven't done our jobs. We need to move from deficit frame coverage to strengths-based narrative. Too often our coverage frames communities that are most affected by the climate crisis through a victim frame, when in fact they have agency and authority in their lives, and many of them are adapting and being resilient to climate right now. And finally, we need to move from disconnection to connections that catalyze communities to take action. If we are going to do anything about the climate crisis we are living in, all 8 billion and counting of us need to be catalyzed to do something different and be somebody different. And media plays a huge role in that. We know that solutions journalism activates people to engage in responses to problems. We know this through our research. And most importantly, for journalists who may be in this room or on the live stream, we really need to stop telling the same depressing story over and over and over again. I don't think we're happy doing it. I don't think we feel good about doing it as journalists. I put this in because who doesn't like Bart Simpson, and who doesn't like the idea that maybe, just maybe, you will stop writing depressing stories and really focus on solutions-focused stories. I'm going to make a quick play for, and I created, this is my first QR code that I've ever done, so I hope it works. We have just launched an application for our Climate Beacon Newsroom Initiative. So we'll be working with 5 U.S.-based newsrooms to transform the way they cover climate. So grab the bit.ly, grab the QR link, and then feel free to come and find me afterward. Now it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Vanya Andre from the Haitian Times, who's going to be speaking about her work that she did as a part of the Business and Sustainability Initiative at Solutions Journalism Network. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanya Andre, and I am a contributing journalist and the board chair for the Haitian Times. I am just going to share a little bit about the Haitian Times for those of you who may not be familiar. So the Haitian Times was founded in 1999 by Pulitzer-winning journalist Gary Pierre. He was a former reporter for the New York Times and left the Times to start the Haitian Times because he really could envision a readership that was more like my generation. I'm a second-generation Haitian American born and raised in Queens. And at the time when he started the paper, a lot of the coverage on the community was a bit sporadic, although there was a growing community in New York. So it started as a weekly print publication, primarily covering the Haitian diaspora in English in the Northeast and at times in Haiti. In 2012, we transitioned to online only, which really, for us, was able to expand the reach of our coverage and also the audience. At the time of the founding of the paper, we saw main communities of Haitians in the Northeast, primarily Brooklyn, parts of Massachusetts, parts of Jersey, and then also some parts of Florida. But by the time that we transferred to digital only, we really saw a growing community that kind of followed the migration patterns of the community. So we started to see growing populations in Dominican Republic, in the Bahamas, kind of seeing also them growing in Brazil, parts of Central America, and Mexico. So a big part of us was really trying to capture the stories of the folks in those communities and to really be able to give them a platform to be able to share some of the issues that were of concern to them. So I'm going to first, start off with showing, when you Google Haiti, typically what you will see are images like this. Okay, lots of destruction, chaos, the world is ending. And that's not to say that that is not in part an accurate portrayal to some extent of what's going on, but the stories are so much more bigger and vast than that. So in 2020, we decided to engage our audience and really try to have a community listening tour where we could kind of get a sense of what was the kind of coverage that was important to them. And the thing that really resonated with us and was very potent was that our readers, they did not want to only see this. Yes, this was a reality of what was going on in the country, but they also wanted to be able to see stories that reflected the positive things that were going on in the country, that also highlighted, the arts and culture, the successes that have happened in the community within the past 25 years. So for us internally as an organization, we knew that there was not going to be a shortage of coverage of everything that was going wrong in Haiti. I mean, if you tuned on to the news last year, you would see that obviously, our former president was assassinated. We had another earthquake. There were hurricanes. But however, we really wanted to make it a point within our editorial strategy to also focus on what was going right. And that was a lot in what motivated us to become a part of the initial Solutions Journalism program to see how we can better do that. And so to talk a little bit about my work with Solutions Journalism, we decided to go to Haiti in January 2021 to learn about a partnership that HP had in place with one of the few recycling facilities in Haiti. And really the premise of this was to think about, one, how could they ethically source materials for their ink cartridges, for their computers, but then also how could we solve a problem that's an ongoing issue in the country. To give some context, there is a lot of improper trash disposal in the country. When you think of the priorities that the government, that community leaders have to focus on, climate and ethical trash disposal is a little bit lower on the totem pole given everything else that they've had to contend with. So that was the second thing. How can we solve this problem? And then third, how could we create opportunities for local community in order to be able for this to be a win-win situation? So the first story, how Haiti's trash fuels a global tech giant, really looked at this young man named Edward Carré, who really made a career out of trying to solve this problem for Haiti and their plastic trash. And essentially, he was connected with the folks at HP in order to create this program where HP was able to purchase plastic bottles that were collected from community members in Haiti. And then from there, the plastic bottles would be sent to Edward's plant, washed, and then turned into plastic pellets that they would eventually ship off to Montreal and make its way to HP to get into their products. The second story really was a real treat to work on because that focused on how they were able to put together this washing line in the middle of the pandemic. So just to take a few steps back, At the onset of this, the launch of this project, the goal was to have the engineers of this wash line, and they were coming from Germany, Switzerland, to be able to come to Haiti and put together this wash line. The pandemic hit, everything was remote. So essentially, Edward and his team, they put together the wash line virtually via Zoom. The engineers sent whatever manuals that they could online, and they put their heads together in order to make sure that this still launched, although we were in the middle of the pandemic. And so one of my fears with approaching this story, because I knew that part of it was solutions. And prior to the program with Solutions Journalism, my biggest fear was that this was going to end up being some type of hero worship, where here we are saying HP, this multi-million-dollar corporate company, is coming to a small country like Haiti, and they're doing this great work, and let's just pat them on the back. And that's what I wanted to steer away from. If there was a problem that was actually being solved, wonderful. Love to highlight that, but wanted it to move past that. And so one of the two biggest things that I took away from the program that really helped guide my reporting was that a lot of what solutions journalism is based on is not just praising the solution part of it, but being able to, one, see what evidence there is to support the solution that they claim that they are making, and then also being truthful and honest about what these limitations in these solutions look like, so that way there's a way to improve on this strategy. So, the two things that I can highlight that came apart from my reporting, the evidence. 2.4 million pounds of ocean-bound plastic diverted since 2016. That's huge because of all of the consequences that come with having plastics within the ocean. But one of the biggest limitations that we explored in the reporting was to pay for the workers. It translated to about $3 a day. And one thing that I was really happy about is that HP was very transparent and open about them acknowledging that this pay was not the highest. However, what they had put in place in the meantime are a series of social wraparound services to help supplement where there was that pay gap. So, for example, this main landfill where they work, there's a community in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, where they sourced a lot of this plastic material, and this is where a lot of the collectors, they were getting the plastic that they sold. So they provide educational support to the students. There's a small school there. They also support wraparound health services. In 2021, last year in August, when there was the earthquake and the hurricane, they made sure that they provided health and housing and any support they could in order just to fill in that gap where the finances would come into play, but then how can we help the community so it's not exploitive? And so for me, the biggest thing that I took out of my experience with solutions journalism was that for me personally as a reporter, I know there's always going to be an opportunity to cover about the politics in Haiti. I mean, there's stuff going literally on right now if you turn on MSNBC. But for me, it was just equally important to be able to highlight strategies like this, projects like this that are in the country that have had some type of impact and is able to really not only help the corporation on one side, but also the community on the ground level. So what I'm going to leave with you all today is just a short video that we were able to put together so you can see behind the scenes of what the process in the plant looks like, from the plastics all the way down to the pellets. that's all. Well, thank you everyone for your time, and I'll be around if you have any questions.
Thank you, Vanya. Thank you, Farah. From now on, when somebody asks me what I do, I'm going to say I'm a service dog and just kind of let that hang there. I'm curious, how many people in the last week read a news story that was related to the climate or environment, by show of hands? Okay, quite a few. It's a climate event. That makes sense. You read more than the sports section. And of those stories, how many of them pointed towards something constructive or useful? Okay, a trickle. Well, we're going to show you some more examples of how we can be doing this better and differently. Lissa Harris is a local news reporter and brings this perspective. Local news plays an imperative role in covering the climate crisis. She is from the Catskills region, which, if you live in New York City, all of your fresh water comes from there, out of your tap. She covers that issue and many more. In addition to being an MIT-trained science writer, she also is a volunteer firefighter. So if someone sneaks a cigarette in the coat room and the place goes up, we're going to be good, no pressure. Lissa Harris, please.
Thank you so much. The irony is not lost on me. I'm here at the Explorers Club, the beating heart of travel and exploration, talking to you all about why it's so important to double down on local and to dig into stories in your own backyard. And if I had known as a young teen that, digging into things in my own backyard would bring me here, maybe I wouldn't have been so eager to get away. But yes, I am now a freelancer in the rural Catskills, and have spent the better part of 15 years kind of doubling down on my own backyard and doubling down on the idea that local news and complicated, difficult beats like climate, not limited to climate, but definitely including climate, really truly belong together. And a good chunk of that time was spent as the founding editor and occasional publisher of the Watershed Post, which we really had a trial, I want to say trial by fire, but really it was trial by water in 2011 when the Irene floods hit the Catskills region and catapulted us from a couple of journos doing kind of an experimental blog out of our house to the only news outlet that was doing real-time news on an unfolding disaster that no other reporters could get to, except for the weeklies that were the print weeklies that are the main outlets that serve that rural area, but that were not really equipped to deal with breaking news online. They were in a kind of publish every Wednesday cycle, and they were just not equipped to deal with it. So our readership grew overnight. I learned a lot about disaster reporting, and I look back at that now, and I think that was a climate disaster. That was a preview of what we will all be doing in local journalism increasingly as the world unfolds and changes and is harmed by climate. So, working in a deep rural news desert, as I have been since 2010, in a place like this, writing the stories, reporting the stories is only a tiny part of the work. It's not easy, but it's not remotely the whole work. There is so much work in a place like that needs to be done to build the audience for the work and to build the support for the news outlet that can build a relationship with that audience and serve that audience faithfully and be trustworthy and sustain the work financially. And that is such a tough nut to crack. I wish I could say that I cracked it, but that is the work. And it's not just the work in rural upstate New York, it's the work everywhere in vulnerable communities. And communities that are vulnerable to the climate crisis are also so often communities that are underserved by news. They don't have their own local news outlets. If they do have their own local news outlets, those local news outlets are hanging on by a thread. They're struggling to exist. They are struggling to connect with larger audiences and with the constantly changing business model of news. So, that's rather dire. But despite that, I really believe this, that the news that matters to people, to most people, is the news in your backyard, wherever it is that you live, that there is no news that connects more to people than the news that's happening in your neighborhood, in your community. This picture is from a meeting of the Board of Supervisors of Delaware County, where I live. I think it's from 2016, and they're discussing taxation of solar farms. And I believe there was one reporter at that meeting, if memory serves, and it was because I sent him. I paid him to go. So this is what we're dealing with. We've got so many climate stories on the local level, but they're not getting covered because so few local news outlets have the resources to really dig into this beat, which is, it's complicated, it's tough, it requires humility, it requires intellectual curiosity, it requires great breadth and knowledge. And, local news outlets are struggling even to pay a few stringers to go to meetings. So it's a tall order to ask them to do this stuff. But, the benefit of covering this stuff in a local way is that even though local news isn't flashy, it doesn't often get widely read, it is deeply trusted in a way that national and international news just is not. Across a broad swath of the community. Local news connects people across truly huge gulfs of class and culture and politics in a way that you truly would not believe unless you have run a local news outlet or spent time sorting through the reader mail that a really local news outlet gets from so many people in the community. And having done that work, let me tell you, this is stuff that really gets people literally where they live. And it's astonishing. People will care about climate stories that are local, even if they don't necessarily care real hard about climate as an issue. They care about them because it matters to them materially and personally and tangibly. And so there's a huge opportunity here for climate journalism to connect to people on a really deep, very real level if they had the resources to take advantage of that. So, we've heard from Farah tonight. I so appreciate her remarks on this, a lot about what's wrong with climate stories. The scale of climate stories is often so huge. I think about Douglas Adams a lot in this regard. I don't know how many of you have read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but I see some heads nodding. There's a scene in that book where Arthur Dent is trying to get his head around the fact that aliens have destroyed the Earth, the entire Earth, and he just can't grasp it. He's trying to kind of give himself an emotion by telling himself that everybody he ever knew is dead, and he just can't do it. It's too big. So that's one problem, but it's not the only problem. There are various ways that climate stories get framed so often that kind of take away the agency that people feel about climate problems and the connection that they feel to climate problems. In addition to feeling overwhelmed by the vastness of the news and the hopelessness of the news, climate story framing can make it seem like climate is a problem for somebody else to solve, some powerful people who aren't you, or maybe a problem for other people to experience, either in the future or in a different place than the place that you live. Also, sometimes when climate stories do talk about solutions, they kind of have this glib silver bullet framing like, is this thing going to save the planet? And, as Farah has said, no. There is no one thing that's going to save the planet. So, a lot of solutions journalism, the philosophy of solutions journalism and the approach of solutions journalism really resonated with me even before I did the training. But having spent the last year, I've been so lucky to have been able to spend a full year really covering climate from a local, regional perspective and from a solutions standpoint with the full support of my publication and with some support from SJN. And it's really been nothing short of a conversion experience for me. So this is my 95 theses. I'm going to nail them to the door like Martin Luther, except I'm from upstate New York, so I'm going to duct tape them. These are the stories that I'm not going to write again in my career. If you catch me writing these stories, email me and tell me to stop. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these. And once you kind of learn to recognize these, I promise you, you will see them absolutely everywhere. So both Vanya and Farah talked a little bit about this one. You know, look at this hero. Look at this cool person who's doing this cool project. Look at this cool technology, right? It's very easy as a reporter to get sucked into this, you know, because a lot of us, let's face it, we're big dorks. We like cool stuff. We like cool people. We like hanging out with cool people. But you know, this is not a pathway to action. This is not a pathway to solutions. And so what solutions journalism framing can do is really kind of give you the tools to, you know, don't walk away from characters. Like, you can still have characters in your story, but don't center everything on them. Really dig into what is this person's role in the response to the problem? What's the larger system here? What's the work that's going on? And what's supporting them in that work and what's holding them back for that work? Here's another story that I have become deeply, deeply frustrated with. And this is one that you'll see about climate all the time. We've seen a lot of it recently as climate has become big politics news in the U.S. Baseball is happening. This is the framing where the climate problem is framed as a fight between two political forces and doesn't really get into the issue of, like, you know, who is this problem actually affecting? You know, it's covered like baseball teams. Whether it's Democrats and Republicans or different factions fighting about policy. You know, people using the climate crisis as a way to win or lose. You know, when climate problems don't get fixed, who loses? We lose. Everybody on planet Earth loses, but especially people who live in climate vulnerable communities. Those people lose. So, you know, for myself as a journalist, solutions training is very helpful in really centering who is affected by these policies, who's going to be hurt or helped by them, who's trying to make better policies, and what's the scientific evidence behind this policy that people are trying to enact. Those are better questions, and if you're not asking those questions in your journalism, it's a wasted opportunity. Here is a kind of story that I know we've all seen. Everything is terrible. This is the overwhelming story. This is the world is burning story. And this one is a little bit tough because it's not that it's wrong. You know, we have a lot of loss that has already happened because of climate change, and we have loss that we are going to have to face. We have grief that we are going to have to face personally in our communities, and especially as reporters whose job it is to get close to grief and loss. We have to tell those stories. But, you know, we can't stop there. And I really think, I truly believe that local news especially is a very good guide to how to approach these things because, and you know, I say this from the perspective of somebody who's covered disaster in my own community where I grew up. When a terrible disaster hits a community in a big enough way that it makes national, international news, it makes headlines all over the place, news outlets will flood in and they will come and they will do the story and they will tell about the terrible tragedy, and then when the disaster is over, they go away. They leave town. And the local paper is going to be there for weeks and months and sometimes years afterwards asking, what happens next? What are the recovery efforts that are afoot? How can we be more resilient next time? How can we avoid another disaster? What are the paths to action? And I think that's a better model for climate, and I think it's a way that climate journalism writ large can learn from local news outlets. So I want to talk a little bit about the work that SJN supported me and my outlet, The River, this Hudson Valley-based news outlet, with literal financial support to do through the Business and Sustainability Initiative. This was the story that I started with, when I started thinking about this series. It's about the schooner Apollonia, which maybe some of you have heard of, because this was a very media-friendly story. So many news outlets reported on it. This was a sail freight vessel that was going up and down the Hudson River. They had their first season last year, shipping malt mainly, but also other food goods up and down the Hudson from various port towns to New York City. And I really wanted to tackle this from a solutions standpoint and ask, is this really a climate solution? Is this a real story? I don't want to do a gee whiz story. I don't want to do a hero story. And there were so many news outlets that were just like, oh, look at this cool project. This was really interesting for me. It was also really tough. It's tough to follow, 24 publications all writing a story about the same thing. But by really leaning into the pillars of solutions journalism, particularly number 4, limitations, really looking at limitations and saying, where did this project, what are the tough spots here? What are the pain points? And it was so interesting doing this work because this story was one where it was billed as a way to kind of, save on carbon, and that was, that's the focus here, is we're going to decarbonize our transportation network. But I actually was able to get data on the the season and how much carbon was displaced, if you will, by it, and the actual dollar value of that carbon as calculated by an algorithm used by New York State. And it added up to the grand total of $86.75. It was the most astonishing figure. I had to sit down. I was like, is this real? Is this my life? Is this my story? But looking into that story in a deeper way and teasing out what the project was succeeding at, it went so much farther beyond just the carbon story. And it became really an example for me of how when you set out to solve a climate problem, because climate problems are so connected to everything else, to our economic systems and to the ways that we've oriented our lives, this project was actually having success in other ways that had nothing to do with carbon. They are reviving ports that have not seen cargo and commerce in generations. They are building new networks among small businesses that are in the kind of farm to food economy, and they're building a lot of really interesting business relationships, and they're creating resilience in a supply chain that has been heavily tested by COVID, by the pandemic, by just-in-time logistics. So there's interesting successes here, but not necessarily carbon ones. And it was cool to really tease out the evidence and get into it. So this was part of a 3-part series, and in each of these stories that The River did, talking about limitations and digging into limitations, for me as a reporter, was key to finding what the insight was in the story. And there's kind of an impulse around climate stories, like not to dig too hard into limitations, because you don't want to squash a beautiful thing. You don't want to put down a beautiful thing. People are trying to do good work, right? And the point of leaning into work on limitations is not to denigrate a project. Like Vanya said, also, it is to show the pain points. It's to show the places where maybe if we put more work into this place, then this solution could scale up a little bit better. This solution could be more widely adopted. It provides pathways to action. When you point out what the limitations of a project are, you show the community, okay, we could do this part differently. The solar grazing story was a good example of that. One of the factors I heard from farmers and ag economists that is holding solar grazing back in New York State is that there aren't enough sheep. literally to fulfill the role. And one of the things that is holding the sheep herding industry back in New York State is that there aren't enough slaughterhouses. And farmers are making appointments months in advance, hours away, to get their animals processed for meat. So I don't know how many of you had on your bingo cards not enough slaughterhouses as an impediment to climate solutions, but I certainly did not. I learned something. I'm going to end with a plea, which I think I always do these days. I've been working in local news, and especially in rural local news in my own hometown community for a long time now. And local news is not well. And up to and including the the news outlet, the digital site that I did the work for SJN on. I left the river in midsummer of this year, and since I left, they have no dedicated staffers. I hear that they're hiring a part-time editor. I'm happy for them. But they have severe financial challenges. I had to shut down my own outlet, the Watershed Post, after 7 years because we were not financially sustainable. These little community papers cannot keep the lights on, and they need help. And I just want to urge all of you, if you have a local paper, even if it's struggling to do good work, especially if it's struggling to do good work, support them. They need you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lissa. When you were speaking, I was reminded of a book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit, where she looks at the early 1900s fire in San Francisco as well as the more recent flooding in Louisiana. And she spent time with communities and learned how during this dark time people actually came together and had a sharp joy because of it, which runs counter to so much of the narratives we see in the mainstream media that try to pump up our adrenaline and zoom in on the broken windows and incidences like that. And that only comes from journalists building trust with communities. Finally, before we take questions from all of you, we have Beth Daly of The Conversation, where she is the executive editor and general manager. She was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. She was a finalist for her climate reporting with over 2 decades of work for the Boston Globe. She also spent time at Stanford University for their prestigious John S. Knight Journalism Fellowship. Beth Daly, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled to be here. I have to, before I tell you a little bit about the conversation and what we're doing, I just want to give a shout out to what FAR is doing. And the idea of solutions journalism, I had heard about it, but in the last month or so I've become so much more intimately involved, I think, since we've talked, and I've delved into it and read these fantastic stories. Like, who knew slaughterhouses were like holding back a climate solution? It's just super great. But I do want to take a step back and say something. Before I started covering climate, I had the great pleasure for 1 year and 1 year only before the Boston Globe crashed into financial crisis itself, was this being the space reporter. I'm really into astronomy, and it was, you talk about a whole full story, like talking about like finding, aliens during the rover's landing. There was not a story that could go wrong. I mean, things blew up occasionally, granted, but it was a story about hope and vision, and it was really easy to cover as a journalist. But unfortunately, the Globe decided to get rid of the space beat, sadly, but I was lucky enough to become the climate reporter for almost 2 decades there. And I did that kind of Bart Simpson thing for a really long time. I wrote really depressing stories. It was early on, I'm old, and it was maybe, the science was not quite there yet, even with the IPCC back when I started in the early 2000s. And so I would write a story, and what you want as a reporter is you want to land on the front page. Like, you want people to read your stories. Every journalist wants a reporter to read their stories. And at the beginning, it was really hard because it was a time we were introducing the climate crisis to the world. But very quickly, I mean really, really quickly, the story that was made the front page every single time got relegated to the front section of the Metro Region section. And then, ultimately, all my stories got relegated literally to the obit page. because it was the same story again and again and again. It was like the species are going extinct, things are going really, really bad. And it was not only depressing for my editors, it was boring. No one wanted to read about it because it didn't go deeper. It didn't get deeper into the story. And I wish solutions journalism had existed then, because I would have gone into it wholeheartedly. However, I do something very different now, and I try to focus on solutions. I run something called The Conversation. You probably have not heard about it, but our newsroom in this middle of this massive media crisis is academics. I'm going to tell you really quickly about it, because you probably have not heard about it. The Conversation started in Australia 12 years ago. And it started basically to provide something that was not happening there with Rupert Murdoch had bought most of news outlets in Australia, and there was very little independent news happening. At least some people thought so. So this very visionary guy named Andrew Jaspin said, hey, why don't we ask academics to write stories? And our journalists will edit them, and then we'll publish them. This sounded really, really good until, and I apologize to all the academics here, academics can't really write for a journal audience that well. It's a big surprise. So he decided that I'll explain a little bit more about it. But we've grown now. I run the U.S. version, which is, I think, the largest outside of Australia. We are in UK, Spain, France. You can read it all. The continent of Africa. We're nonprofit news organizations, independent. We're supported by big foundations like Gates and Packard and Ford, as well as universities that support our mission to democratize knowledge for the public good, and individuals. So just really quickly, early on, with the crash in local journalism right now that Lisa talks so eloquently about, academics are really an untapped social capital to help local journalism and journalism in general. Why? Because it's evidence-based. They actually know what they're talking about. When I was a climate reporter, I often had to spend days, weeks, sometimes years getting to know a subject so well that I was able to write about it. And I still got things wrong, because it's really hard to get things right, even if you're the best reporter in the world and the best writer, because things get edited, meaning is missed, miscommunications happens. So the way it works for us, we get hundreds and hundreds of pitches each week from scholars all around the country. We also think of story ideas ourselves and write to hundreds of thousands of academics through their communications department saying, hey, we need someone to explain why it's called the Ukraine and not Ukraine by some people. And ultimately we get back lots of people interested in writing for us. The academic gets the byline, we're invisible, which is probably why you've not heard of us. We really believe in democratizing knowledge, and there's a vast disconnect between universities in America and the public, as you're probably well aware. We're trying to bridge that gap, and that's by putting the academics in a place they feel very uncomfortable with, which is the public square. We're a Creative Commons. All our articles are free to read and republish anywhere. We're growing quite a bit and pretty quickly right now. It's just a number thing, but we're read about probably close to 20 million times a month now in about 1,000 news outlets. I'm here to talk about climate coverage. And just like Farah had mentioned, through a different statistic, we found 42% of Americans actively avoid the news, at least some of the time. I think that's from Pew. Climate change coverage tends to be important, but they really are missing, solutions are missing, because it's actually easier to write about the problem than the solution or the limitations of a potential solution. And the thing that I've noticed now running the Conversation for 3.5 years is, much like journalists, academics tend to study the problems, but not too much on the solutions all the time. It's very, very similar to that idea of journalists writing about disasters. I was actually telling Farah she needs to get solutions journalism into academia immediately. But they're beginning to think about it. I talked to a lot of academics and a lot of provosts and people, and my colleague Bruce Wilson here is tonight does as well. But they're beginning to really think about solutions, because most academics get into their field of work because they want to make the world a better place. When I go to these climate conferences a lot with academias, and I say, how many of you got into climate change because you really want to save the world? You really want to make the world a better place? And everyone raises their hand, and they wave it. And I say, how many of you actually feel like you made a real world impact? And all the hands go down. every single hand goes down. So there's a problem there, is that they want that. And so I feel like the conversation's a little bit of a bridge to that. So when I arrived at the conversation, we had one environment editor, which was wonderful. But shortly after I arrived, we kind of examined that work pretty carefully, and we were doing good work about new research coming out in biodiversity, climate, and whatnot. But it was missing that idea of much what Farah talked about, this concept of solutions. And I don't pretend to be as rigorous as the Solutions Journalism Project yet, but we really decided we needed to think about, get more people writing about climate and the environment. So we were able, through, well, not through any fundraising, unfortunately, but we were able to fund a climate editor who came with me from Inside Climate News. And so now we have, and we hired some freelancers to really try to cover the climate crisis in a much more deeper way. And we're now getting into climate investigations and solutions with a new grant we have. And I want to give you an example of some of this. All our stories are pretty short. They kind of, you know, we're published in like Scientific American, Washington Post, CNN, Fox News, and what I'm proud about, like hundreds of small papers across America every month. But our stories often have to fit kind of a formula. They have to be about 1,000 words long because people feel they get too long to actually fit in a print newspaper. And digitally, there's like this old world idea that stories still have to be short. I mean, The Atlantic republishes us too, and sometimes they'll allow for long pieces. We're hoping for more of that. But we really, looking at our metrics, we realized that people were reading the climate disaster stories, but just like what happened to me when I covered climate, the interest really fell off, like after a short amount of time. So we've been trying a lot harder to find those solutions. We try to publish 2 a week. So this is one example. You know, concrete, unbeknownst to me, I think it's like 8%. I think that's right, of emissions worldwide. I could have that a little off, but it's high, really high, and it's super energy intensive. And so we looked at these 4 innovative ways to clean up this thing, and we went relatively deep into some of these answers, but we'd like to do more and go much deeper to explain like the limitations of them. And so, for example, and to do this really quick, you know, it doesn't have to be 100% cement when you deal with, you know, concrete. There's lots of new ideas happening in academia that's still very experimental, but some of it is not. Some of it's actually being tested and used right now. So that's one example. And I'm just going to show you, as the last speaker, I know it can get tiring, so I'm just going to give you just some other examples of what we do. So again, we're trying to say, like, it's awesome that we have these great things going on with clean energy, but now we got to tackle the hard part of it. We do a lot of analysis with our academics and editors, looking at policies that can be political, certainly, but we try to explain what it means for real people, much to Liz's point. Just for the last one, I think this is the last one, but we also try to touch a lot in agriculture, which is an enormous source of greenhouse gases. And there's still a lot of challenges to fix the problem there. So I don't want to spend too much time on all of these, but we really feel academics can really start changing the tide and helping journalism more through both providing really evidence-based research in this world of disinformation. It's not there, particularly climate disinformation. But at the same time, they can provide the data that journalists can use, and we see a real symbiotic relationship. Right now, at the conversation, the academics actually write the stories. We see a future where we have the academics and the journalists working together hand in hand, and you'll see bylines in the New York Times and the Washington Post and small papers around the world that say, okay, this is by this academic and this journalist. So that's the dream. These are just a few more. I'm not going to go through them all. But that's it from me. Thank you so much. Super interesting. I don't know what happens now. Turn this off.
I'd love to invite the speakers up for the Q&A. Meg Haywood-Sullivan will be around the room to take your questions. So please, anything that's occurred to you while listening to this or what you think about while you're trying to fall asleep at night. We want them.
We have our first question right here.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. This was great. As a writer for mainstream media outlets, also a freelancer in the past, a lot of times it's hard, especially when you're early in your career and starting out, to convince editors that this is okay because of things like headlines and analytics. Sometimes a story that you report in this way gets really pared down in edits to be not this way. And that can be really frustrating for people who are low on the totem pole. So what would some of you maybe suggest are some things that conversations writers can have with the people in charge to see how we can bring these important tactics to basically keep those nuances in our stories from the reporting to the final product?
Wow, that was loud. I will start, but then thank you for the question. Yeah, it's something that comes from our journalists all the time, and my glib answer is send your editors to us. But there is research that says I think it's interesting to think about how we monetize news, right? And it's about impressions and page views and et cetera, time spent and all of that. Those are imperfect measurements of what communities really need and imperfect measurements of the impact. And so what I often say to our journalists is to really center the community and to continuously have a conversation with your editors about this isn't about a page view. This is about impacting communities that are most affected by climate change. And I know those are hard conversations to have because, to be honest, that's the way news makes money, is through page views. That's what advertisers want to buy. But increasingly, I would also say that I think the advertising community is realizing that those metrics don't make any sense. They all agree that they're sort of, as I said a few years ago on a stage, they're bullshit because we can game those numbers. And what's really important is impact and connection with community. So I'll hand it over to whoever else wants to take that question.
Just, I was going to say, well, first of all, you should ask Farah for the research that backs up that solutions journalism connects with audience, because there is research on that front that SJN is doing, and it was so helpful as a reporter to hear that. It's not just me thinking, oh, this is great, this is such great stuff. There's actually, some metrics behind that. But also I would say, any way that you as a reporter, and this is maybe a little weirdly easier on a hyper-local level because you're so connected with your audience, but ways that you can hear back from your audience, ways that you can collect reader feedback and really show, if you say to your editor, give me a chance on this, I will demonstrate that, I've made this connection with the community. I can show you the letters that I got. I can show you the feedback that I got. Because if you do this work and you keep showing up to this work, you will build relationships and you will get that feedback, and you can put it in an impact report. You can show it to an editor.
I would just add also that, they say that journalists write the first draft of history, and this is a conversation that we have a lot at the Haitian Times. How much resources do we put in these longer pieces that maybe will not garner as many page views as a shorter piece or something that's not as nuanced. And what I would implore you to have these conversations with your editors is to show that, yes, this may not be the highest clicked article, but it's important to have certain coverage there for the record, for history, whether or not this is just to make sure that the community is aware of it, because it may not be read, the most read article this month, but you have no idea who's going to find this a year from now, 2 years from now. And then secondly, there's also something to be said, for reporters we want our stuff to be read, but we also want accolades for it. So sometimes those are the stories that really do well around the award circuits. So just to keep that in mind, that it may not be something that you have an immediate return now, but there's something to be said just to make sure that that record is there for whoever needs to find it in the future, and that these are the type of stories that usually do well for award submissions.
Much better at this. Yeah, I was going to kind of say this idea, which is really kind of awful. Like when I was at the Globe, even the Globe, which is was at the time fairly resourced, every time I did like a big investigative project that would take me a year or longer to do, I had to do it on my weekends. You know what I mean? It wasn't the editors, because, I agree with Sarah somewhat, like impact should not be measured in page views and clicks. It still is in a lot of ways, even for us. Like that's what our funders want to see, and we're a nonprofit. But I hope that's changing. We work really hard on finding impact, like did someone use it on the floor of the House, or in Congress? That's really powerful for people to hear, and I think that's a kind of impact that we're really seeing a lot more of. A lot of our scholars are NPR like twice a week now. They look at the conversation. But I will say, getting back to how do you do that? I think you can do that hard conversation, but sometimes you got to do the work before you convince them, like that's the story, you know what I mean? And ahead of time, because very few editors, and I was one of them, will say yes to something that feels like a time investment without a definite return. I hate to say that.
Underpaid and extra work by journalists is a whole nother conversation. Get creative. You can tell climate stories without saying the word climate. Animals are showing up in places they haven't been before. Bears are going to swimming pools to find drinking water. Ticks are spreading throughout the Northeast. There's human health angles. So I think it's really, climate stories are everywhere, and you don't even have to mention the word.
So my question deals with what you're doing. A couple of concerns seem to be raised. One is, how do you make your, I'm going to pose this sort of an overall scheme. You have local stories that are going to be geared towards the local people. How do you scale that up? And then you have, taking the Haitian example, a wonderful story about recycling the plastic in Haitian, but that's buried from a national perspective because everything else in Haiti is negative, and so to me that's a problem. If you want to get the general populace, how do you get those local stories to be national stories, and how do you get the local good story to become a national story, overwhelmed by the other things? And the other thing that sort of drives this, I think, this whole process with respect to climate change is the policy initiatives. When you're talking about climate change, obviously you're going to get that momentary thing with disasters. People are going to react. But that doesn't get converted in many respects to anything. It's just a terrible situation. Let's send some aid there. We seem to move on in terms of solutions. And the other part of that equation is the economics behind it, that businesses don't seem to want to react. If there's a cheaper alternative, for example, now with respect to fossil fuels, there's this movement to get away from fossil fuels. But then again, that doesn't seem to solve anything. So we're sort of in this box, essentially, with respect to how do you get policy to be effective, how do you get business to be effective, how do you get local good stories to become nationalized, and how do you overwhelm the national stories of a particular country like Haiti to become subsumed by the positive stories, and how you can gross up these positive results to a much more impact thing. So the common person who's not going to see your articles will say, wait a second, let's do those things, or businesses, let's get behind those things, to have a greater impact as opposed to just the small scale initiative that we see.
Oh, there was a lot there to unpack, so maybe pick a piece of that to respond to.
I'll start with the Haiti example. So I'm actually going to reference a new series that we launched last week. We did an 8-part series looking at the gang crisis in Haiti that I'm sure many of you have seen on the national news circuit. And part of that of our series really was focused, one, on being able to give an overall view of what's going on, but then the the rest of the articles really were focused on possible solutions that could be taken to help this problem. And part of what we do at the Haitian Times on the editorial side is really making sure that we are helping to set the tone for coverage on Haiti in a national scale. So, for example, with the Gang series, our editor-in-chief, our founder, they have appeared on MSNBC, on CBS, helping to contextualize a lot of the issues that are going on, but then to also give that nuanced perspective of like, yes, this is everything that's going wrong, but these are the possible solutions that we have talked to people on the ground, to problem solvers, to community leaders, to crisis experts on how to mitigate these issues. Another example of that is last year when we saw a lot of the unfortunate activities on the border with ICE and Homeland Security and Haitian migrants. And one of the biggest things for us in the newsroom was being able to distinguish to readers and to help educate producers, national media reporters on the difference between someone that's undocumented, someone that's an asylum seeker, someone that is a migrant, because language matters, and how we speak about people and their experiences and what's expected of them when they come to this country is important. So for us, that's how we try to take like really, smaller issues that are of importance to our community, and we scale that up by making sure that we're positioning our editorial leadership in ways where they can help educate the national media on how to talk about Haiti and offer a nuanced perspective that isn't just focused on the doom and gloom of what's happening in the country.
I'm wondering if I can be a little bit of a contrarian here from the local news perspective and say, as a local news reporter, I don't know if it's super necessary for local news outlets always to seek to scale up and to reach that wide audience and to paint with that broad brush. From my perspective, as somebody who is embedded in my own local community, who spent a long time building a trusted audience in that community, I want to live in a place whose information needs are getting met, where the local news ecosystem is healthy. When something devastatingly large happens in my community, I would like the national media to turn to us on the ground first. I would like them to listen to us. But, day to day, I don't need my story to be front page everywhere. I need my community to have its information needs met and to have its local news ecosystem to be healthy. And I just don't think that, that every project needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger in order to measure success in the journalism world, especially, communities are different from each other. They're going to need different kinds of news outlets. I'm always aware when I'm writing for a local audience that audience is my main audience. I'm aware of what that audience is like, and I try to think about what they need. And it's not the same thing as what the world needs to know about the place where I live. So just to kind of push back on that a little bit, so not everything needs to scale up, and we do need to hear the climate solution stories, and maybe those solutions need to scale up. But maybe what we need in order to really engage better with the climate problem as journalists is to have a more healthy and robust news ecosystem that isn't so spotty, that doesn't leave so many communities out of the conversations that are happening around climate solutions.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm also going to do a little bit of turning it back on the audience. It's really easy to just sort of ground yourself in the thing you always read every day, right? The app is on your phone, and you just keep reading the thing that's on your phone. And you keep following the same people on Twitter and keep reading the same things. And I would say back to you, the audience, because you have a huge impact on the economics of news. The reason that we do what we do is because you tell us that's what you want. So stop telling us that that's what you want. If you don't want doom and gloom stories and you want more solutions or better local news or better reporting about Haiti, go find it. Read the Haitian Times. Read The River, look at the conversation. It's so easy for us, and I speak for myself as a news consumer. I have the a handful of news organizations that I look at every day. But I increasingly keep my eyes on news organizations that are covering my community, but also covering things that I'm really interested in. So I'd also say, don't forget that you as news consumers can have a great impact on the news that we serve to you. So stop clicking on the doom and gloom. Like, just stop, right? Because you can tell us what you want by the very actions that you take. So subscribe to your local newspaper. Expand your horizons. Follow different people on Twitter, or get off of Twitter. Whichever works for you. So that's what I would turn about as fair play, right? So yeah.
I think we have a question here, and then perhaps we'll take one more and have some final thoughts. I just wanted to add quickly that I've reported with a lot of communities who are suffering different forms of exploitation for goods and services that travel very far away from them to meet needs of people who have no idea that that's where it's coming from. And even if there's not a scale kind of a question, there's always a lesson to be learned about power, right? These stories are about science, but they're also about how power works in our culture. Who's making the decisions? Who's saying, no, we don't want this in our community. We need this instead. And local news and getting those stories out is the difference between communities being able to have that agency and act for themselves and not.
Thanks, y'all, for this. I guess I'd be really curious to hear perspectives on, like, individually as climate journalists, what's your goal? Like, or for climate journalism as a field, like, what's the goal? It seems like implicitly here the goal is to make people maybe more aware of, like, the ubiquity of climate consequences and just, like, the wholesale nature of, like, engagement and change required to, like, rise to it. But it might be more subtle or individual than that. So that'd be cool to hear.
Preventing extinction comes to mind. Collapse of civilization. Anyone else?
I think, that's a really great question, because it's an individual question, and it's also one really posed to the field of journalism. And, there's certain truths in journalism, like, that people accept, like democracy is good. We sort of have that foundation here. Education is a good thing, and I think now climate is a problem that needs to be solved. And there's certainly people who don't believe that, but that idea of, are we advocating for something to change? You know what I mean? Is it, at least for me in journalism, has been a little bit hard to come to. But I think the field of climate journalism is doing just that overall, is that we're telling people there's a problem here and it needs to be solved, and presenting people with a lot of solutions, a lot of limitations, but it remains up to the people to decide what to do about it. And I guess my personal view when I covered climate was the same thing, with a little bit of ego put into that as well, to do a good job.
I think, for me, this is another realm in which I've been really lucky over the past year to be in a place where I had a lot of support from the people above me to basically just, to do what I do, and without a lot of pushback. That I was really able to be upfront with readers and, with our audience, to be like, okay, I'm coming at this from a perspective of, I think that climate is a problem that should be solved. Like, that sounds super basic, but, reporters are uncomfortable with saying things like that as a kind of a declarative statement, like you're putting yourself out there. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be affiliated, like, with activists in terms of, sort of taking their agenda on as my own. And there are a lot of ways in which, it's really useful as a reporter to be on guard for ways that, climate advocates' agenda is not going to line up with yours. But that's being able to just get out there and say, look, this is a problem. It's a problem for my community. It's a problem for you, my reader, and I am here ideally to help you solve it. It also, frankly, is increasingly a tension. I feel like the more I learn in the climate solutions world, the more frustrated I am with the limitations of journalism. I'm following a lot of climate journalists on Twitter. There was one person in particular that I was following at GRIST, who left GRIST, terrific solutions-focused environmental news organization. He left his job at GRIST to become an electrician. And one of the solution stories that I reported on for the river was just about how many people we need to train for the green workforce in order to prepare for the climate action jobs that are coming, so that we can accomplish a whole lot of these solutions, particularly in the realm of electrifying home heat and getting fossil fuels out of heating buildings. And I would be lying to you all if I didn't say that is a seriously tempting prospect to me, looking out at the field of journalism and going, you know what, there are climate solutions pathways that don't involve trying to, tell people a story again and again. You could actually just, pick up a tool and do it. So it's tempting to me.
I would say for me, the main thing really is that I would like to see the quality of life for my people in Haiti to improve. And the unfortunate thing with the country is that because there are such a myriad of problems going on, from socio-political, economic issues, food insecurity, when it comes to sustainability and climate environment issues, that's low on the totem pole, but it's usually one of the things that has the biggest impact on quality of life. So when there's flooding, when farmers are unable to have a full crop that year because of lack of water, when there's flooding because of deforestation, it's impacting the most vulnerable communities in Haiti. And in contrast to, let's say, the U.S. or another country in the region that has the social and government support system to help these communities, that's missing in Haiti. So for me, it's really about trying to elevate this beat so that way it gets the attention of the decision makers in the country. So that way, for the next administration, they see this as a priority. For large funders who are looking to do work in the country, their focus isn't just on, let's say, civic engagement or voting issues or food insecurity or health, but also looking at these very real issues that have very real impact for people in the country. So that's my main thing. I just want the beat itself to be elevated when it comes to Haiti, because it's a huge outsized problem that does not get anywhere near the attention that it needs, given the impact it has on the ground.
I guess personally and professionally, I'm about transforming journalism. Full stop. The way I practiced journalism for the past 35 years, and I think Beth and I are relatively sort of peer members, is the way we've practiced it is broken. And for me, in terms of climate, is to move the coverage of climate from unsolvable and apocalyptic to rigorous evidence-based journalism that holds all stakeholders accountable and catalyzes communities to take action. I have no problem with a catalytic effect of journalism. In investigative journalism, we always want somebody to go to jail. We want somebody to lose their job. We want policy to change. We want all these things to happen when we do investigative journalism. So I'm not sure why we get so tense around solutions journalism and the big A word, advocacy. I don't have a concern with that, particularly because what is important in solutions journalism is grounding it in your community and providing a service to your community and audience. We are too disconnected from the people that we are covering in the media. We sit behind our Zoom. We get stories via Twitter. We never do the shoe leather work, which is going out and meeting with community day after day, month after month, and understanding who they are. And I will end by saying, I'm not going to say my work here is done, but I am like an over-proud mother in some ways, or an over-proud coach. I'm going to use that instead. An over-proud coach to have Vanya and Lissa here, because I hear what they've done, and how powerful this work has been. And I'm just, I'm beyond happy for that work. So for me, I would say my work is not done. It will never be done. But that is, this is evidence of impact in solutions journalism.
I think I'd like to just end by saying that whether we write about it or not, the changes are coming that Farah mentioned. We're in New York. There's a massive emissions reduction plan. That means infrastructure popping up in places it wasn't before. It means power outages. It means all of these things that it might not be this mega international headline, but it's going to show up, and it is in all of our lives already. Any closing thoughts from all of you?
Environmentalism for a long time has been about the word no, and we are rapidly entering a phase in which environmentalism and climate action have to also be about the word yes, and we need to build a lot of stuff, and it's going to be hard, and there aren't going to be real obvious villains and heroes in a lot of this stuff, and there is no better opportunity for journalism. There's so much room for nuanced journalism, but it's going to be really difficult. That's all.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was going to say the same thing. But I don't want to lose the academics. That's what I do. Because I really believe that research is the foundation for solutions in many, many places, in many, many ways. And I feel so strongly that that evidence that's behind the ivory tower in so many places holds the ticket, or the beginning of the ticket, not just to journalism, but to get the word out to the public. And yeah, so I'm hoping we all work together on that.
If you're an academic, talk to Beth. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. And thank you to the Solutions Journalism Network for sponsoring this night and for all of the work you do on behalf of all of us.